Chapter 6. We broke the victims into three categories to make it easier to manage the various cases and their corresponding facts. The first category we called Phase 1, or the test phase, which covered the attacks carried out on the homeless, where no witnesses were present, little physical damage was done, and no resistance was offered. There were 9 individuals added to this category based on the above-mentioned criteria. Sir Happy and I believed the assailant was testing his methods and his means. They were low-risk attacks where the circumstances offered little threat of repercussions, either from the victims or the law, where the perpetrator caught and prosecuted or forced to make monetary amends, assuming the beast could be tied to a person with means. The second category we called Phase 2, or the dress rehearsal phase, which encompassed all of the attacks on random pedestrians, vendors, merchants, and market patrons, where damage was a little more severe and where witnesses were present. 11 souls found their way into this category. We concluded the offender, having successfully executed his previous crimes without being apprehended, decided to escalate by introducing more challenging factors like the presence of witnesses and potential for some resistance. The final category was the one we focused most of our attention on. Although there were fewer members in this group, 7 in total, it was the group which had received the most ruthless treatment. "These are the real targets of our assailant," Sir Happy announced, as we added each name to the file. "He practiced on the other 2 groups to gain the confidence he needed to go after these individuals. I'm not sure of his motives, but I am quite convinced this is the case." We called this final phase the full commitment phase because, once committed, these attacks were the point of no return. If caught, the villain would receive his full measure of justice with the worst possible outcome in sentencing. The attacks were so brutal in nature, I was extremely surprised no one had died as a result of them. Sir Happy said if the offender was not caught soon, we could anticipate a further escalation resulting in the death of the perpetrator's next victim. "Why would you say that, Sir Happy?" I inquired after he pronounced his concern. "It is simple, really," Sir Happy said. Once a serial attacker gets a taste for blood, wounding the victim is no longer enough. There is always escalation. And in this case, there is little more which can be done without inflicting a death wound. It is the very nature of evil, Mommy, to perpetrate greater and greater evils until such point as the evildoer is stopped. I wish I could say it is not the situation with criminals and the crimes they commit, but it is. All of my studying of crimes committed over the last 200 years indicates my statement is true. There will come a day when only a body is left to guide us, a body devoid of the animating spirit which gives each of us life. Mark my words, dear friend, the day is swiftly approaching. I felt sick at the very notion, but could find no words of argument to counter what my friend had said. My instincts told me he was correct. My heart wished otherwise. "I think it is about time we took a break from our efforts, Mommy," Sir Happy said, pushing the case files to the side. "I can see a look of fatigue in your eyes. You are still not fully recovered, my friend, and I would have you completely rested before we continue on with our inquiries. There is little more we can do this night." I could do little more than agree with my friend. I was terribly fatigued and in need of a respite from the stresses of such a dark pursuit. Although I knew our efforts were for the good of all those involved, I could not help but feel the weight of such an evil topic. I took my leisure with a nice cup of tea while Sir Happy spread out the evening paper and began to scan the headlines. My friend's features very quickly twisted into a disquieting combination of horror, anger, and disbelief. I sprang over to see what had upset him so. When he looked up from the article he was reading, his face seemed worn with grief. All he could do was point at the headline which had affected him so violently. I read it and reread it until I was finally forced to recite it aloud in order to convince myself I understood it correctly. The Nipper deals death near Derbyshire. Sir Happy groaned as I read on. Jessup McGibbons was found early Saturday evening near Lexington Courts. His upper body was covered with vicious gashes and bite marks, which most certainly led to his death. The medical examiner declared him dead on sight as a direct result of his wounds. The perpetrator is still at large, and as of now, the yard remains without a suspect. Happy shook his head with defeat. It appears as though we are too late, my friend. I nodded my uneasy assent as I glanced back over the announcement. The abbreviated article was completely devoid of any useful details. There was no mention of witnesses, nor any indication of who found the body. There was nothing in the 4 short sentences which would offer any clues outside of location and name of victim. There was more to my disturbed feeling than the brevity of the article and the terrible news it imparted. It was the disquieting connection the victim's name made to the unpleasant character of Mrs. Eula McGibbons, the cheese-scented governess responsible for my sweet Annie's and my separation. Could it be? I mumbled to myself as I searched the evening paper's pages to find some mention of family or relatives associated with the late Mr. McGibbons. Try as I might, I could find no such reference. I turned to Sir Happy and said, I wonder, old chap, if there might be some familial relation between this poor Jessup McGibbons and the very unpleasant Mrs. Eula McGibbons, who was my sweet Annie's governess. I turned to my friend, hoping to receive some direction from him regarding the possible connection, perhaps even seeking a reprimand for my being so silly as to think there was any correlation at all. Sir Happy was too consumed by his own thoughts to acknowledge me. Not only did he fail to add comment to the things I had just said, he continued in his verbal doldrums, as though I had said nothing at all. I wish to God I had been wrong about our villain. Sometimes I marvel at my own observations. Did I not just pronounce the very thing I wanted least in all the world to happen? He hid his face for just a moment, as if in a state of deep internal reflection. And then, looking intently into my eyes, he declared, Mark me now, Mommy, so you may be a witness. I will find this fellow and bring him to justice. Not wanting to seem too selfish with my own concerns, I returned my comrade's intensity with a bit of my own, as I replied, You shall not stand alone at the moment when justice finds him. I will be with you every step of the way, poor health or not. I gave it a moment before changing the subject back to my own selfish ponderings. So, do you think there is any connection between this poor man and my sweet Annie's ex-governess? I tried to seem nonchalant, as though it was just another passing fancy. Sir Happy looked intently at me for a moment and gave a big sigh, much the same way one does when responding to a child who perpetually insists on asking the same question over and over, regardless of the response. I cannot say one way or the other, my friend, but I do promise you this. If, in the course of our investigation, we find she is a relation to Jessup McGibbons, I shall protect you from any objects which might be hurled in your direction. I was not expecting such a response, and before I knew what I was doing, I found myself overcome with laughter. The notion at my being pelted with pillows by so comical a character as Eula McGibbons was exactly the kind of levity our heavy hearts were in desperate need of. Our amusement, however, was short-lived, and it was not long before the laughter felt a little sour on my tongue. The realization our humor came as a result of a very real human tragedy made me sick at my stomach and more than a little ashamed at myself for being capable of finding any humor in the matter at all. Apparently, my sudden change in mood was echoed by my friend, for neither of us seemed able to maintain our merriment for very long. The whole bloody mess was a travesty of justice. Had the authorities gotten off their laurels in the beginning, when the physical damages were minor, the greater human tragedies which unfortunately came later could well have been avoided. I looked back over our efforts and felt a sudden sense of helplessness. The weight of the burden to find this monster suddenly felt too heavy for me to bear. Somewhere before us lay the evidence that would lead us to our scoundrel, and I desperately wanted to find it. I sifted back through every paper, every photo, and every detail before us. There must be something here which can help us track down this evil soul. The words burst forth from me in mere ragged sobs. I felt slow-witted and stupid at not finding something more helpful from the evidence. I was not born with the gifts that came so easily to my friend Sir Happy, yet my inexperience and lack of investigative practice seemed a poor excuse indeed for my apparent mental stagnancy. It was at this moment of turmoil I felt the reassuring touch of Sir Happy. "Take comfort, Marmee, for my sake," he said. "It is a terrible burden we carry now with one life lost, and Lord knows how many more at risk. But for the moment, let us lay the burden down for tonight. We must be strong in body as well as in spirit, which means we both must rest and eat if we can. In the morning, we will pay a visit to our trusted friend, Inspector Farley, and see if we cannot obtain the particulars of the crime." I knew he was right. There was little more we could do this night. I allowed my friend to guide me over to where supper had been set for us hours before. My heart was willing, but my body was weak, truly weak. As I ate my fill of smoked kipper and bread and milk, I felt the last remaining strength seep out of me. Not sure how or when I got to bed, but thankfully it was a deep and dreamless sleep which refreshed the mind as it renewed the body. Chapter 7. As I walked down to breakfast the next morning, I felt better than I had in weeks. I found myself moving forward with a purpose, which I believe added strength to my recovery. It would be a quick breakfast, and then Happy and I were off to Inspector Farley's headquarters. When I reached the breakfast parlor, however, I was surprised to discover our trip was completely unnecessary. There, sitting at the table, was Inspector Hiram Farley himself, waiting to speak with Dr. Hanover. "Good morning, Mr. Marmee," Inspector Farley said to me with a muted smile. "'Tis sad business indeed which brings me to your door at this hour of the morning." I returned his greeting with a deep rumbling purr of a welcome. But before I could say another word, Sir Happy and Dr. Hanover walked into the room. Inspector Farley stood up as he said, "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm sorry to intrude upon your breakfast time, but I am afraid I have a bit of nasty business to discuss with you. It is about the unfortunate murder of Jessup McGibbons. If you would be so kind, Dr. Hanover, as to examine these photographs and tell me if the bites on McGibbon's body came from the same fiend we have been tracking, I would be most appreciative." Before another word could be said, Amelia walked into the room carrying a tray filled with bowls of porridge, cups of coffee, and a plate piled high with freshly baked pastry. Can we save the grisly details until after we all have broken our fast? She said with a cheerful trill in her voice. I find I cannot tolerate death on an empty stomach. She smiled broadly with her sweetly stated sarcasm and danced into the kitchen to grab a small plate of smoked kipper. I must insert here, I positively adore kipper at breakfast, and I believe more households should offer this flavorful fish on a more regular basis. After our hearty repast was eaten with great thanksgiving, our attentions turned to the deadly business at hand. Inspector Farley pulled out the photographs taken at the scene of the murder, as well as a few shots taken of the body after it was brought to the examiner's office. He also produced a crude mold made from one of the more distinct bite marks on Jessup McGibbon's forearm. The examiner made this mold for you, Doctor, Inspector Farley said. The family was most insistent on receiving the body as quickly as possible, so there was little time to wait for you to come and do it yourself. I poked Sir Happy at the mention of a family, but said nothing which might interrupt the flow of the conversation. Inspector Farley continued. I know it isn't as good as the one you would have made, but I thought it better than nothing at all. I insisted on it, as I was the first inspector on the scene. I even followed the body back to the examiner's office to ensure the examination of the bite and the making of the mold were done in the proper way to give you what you needed. As I examined the evidence on the table, there was no doubt in my mind McGibbons was indeed a victim of our villain, and I mentioned as much to Sir Happy. You are right, Mommy, Sir Happy whispered back. There's no mistaking it. Do you see the gap where the one premolar is missing? He poked at one of the photos, as well as to the mold itself. It has been a consistent indicator with our victims. Stephen watched Sir Happy's and my exchange and took note of the photo Sir Happy indicated. He then turned to Charles, who had just joined us to partake in what was left of our delicious meal, and said, Charles, it seems as though Sir Happy has found something significant with this McGibbons murder. Take a look at the void here in this mold Inspector Farley brought, where the upper right premolar would be found. This void would indicate the tooth was either broken or missing. I would have to take a look at the other molds we have collected, but I believe this is consistent with the other confirmed cases. Turning his attention to Inspector Farley, Stephen said, I believe it is safe to say this death is connected to the other bite cases. I was afraid you might say as much, sir, Inspector Farley said. Can you give me any direction on what type of animal might have done this? Are we quite certain it isn't a wild animal of some kind? Well, Stephen began, I think we can safely establish that our killer is most decidedly canine. It appears to be a large dog with a very powerful head and jaw. There has been no evidence of encephalitis in any of the other victims, which means the canine is not rabid. Of course, encephalitis would make a convenient explanation for the attacks, but never mind that for now. Stephen looked over at Sir Happy. What do you say, old boy? Do you suspect a particular breed? Sir Happy looked very thoughtful as he examined the evidence on the table. All eyes were riveted on him, waiting for his response. Inspector Farley, who had always had a deep respect for animals, especially Sir Happy, seemed intrigued by the whole situation. I discovered later he wondered why Dr. Hanover would pose the question to his dog rather than offer an answer outright. The inspector was far too polite to say anything, however, and did not wish to insult either Stephen or his canine companion by questioning the doctor's reasoning. Sir Happy nudged a set of calipers over to Stephen and instructed the good doctor to measure the size of the bite mold. Stephen, taking the instrument in hand, readily compiled with the barked command. With the measurements taken, Sir Happy asserted his opinion as to the offending breed, and then rested his head on his master's hand. Stephen smiled broadly. "Well done, Sir Happy," Stephen said, giving his pet an affectionate scratch behind the ears. You heard it yourself, Inspector Farley, straight from the old boy's mouth. Our assailant is most likely a mastiff of some sort, or at least one of the breeds used in underground bull baiting or pit fighting. Most of the pit dogs are capable of delivering these kinds of bites, and they would have enough weight and power in their bodies to take down a full-grown man like McGibbons. It could even be a large Staffordshire. They have the strength for it, and are a general favorite in the pits. Inspector Farley's brow crinkled. "Wait a moment," he said. "You mean to say you got all of that from a few barks and Sir Happy pushing the calipers at you?" Stephen nodded emphatically and said, "Of course I did. Sir Happy tells me things all the time, and I feel quite certain I miss more of what he says than I could possibly imagine. He probably speaks to you as well when you came for a visit. All you have to do is listen. Hurrum! Never underestimate the intelligence of these creatures. I guarantee we could learn a lot from them if we could only understand their language." Inspector Farley, or Hiram, as I began to refer to our friend, as seemed most pleased with the outcome of this visit. "Thank you so much for all of your help, both of you," he said, addressing both Dr. Hanover and Sir Happy. "I'll see what I can do to unearth some of the underground pit houses in the area of the murder and scrutinize whatever leads I can dig up there. I dread the job, seeing as how popular the underground sporting is in general, and how protective the rabble can be about their entertainment, but I thank you both nevertheless. At least now I have a direction to take. It felt for a while like I was chasing some kind of a ghost." As soon as Hiram finished his goodbyes, he was on his way, no doubt to begin his search for the ever-elusive underground pit houses. As Stephen and Charles left to begin their duties to the clinic, I turned to Sir Happy. "Now what?" I asked, not quite certain where this morning left us in our investigation. It seemed to me, with the emergence of the murder the previous evening, the authorities at the yard would not rest until they had apprehended the killer, and would comb the streets tirelessly until every lead had been chased down. I felt certain there was little more for us to do. Apparently, my friend did not agree. "We must continue where we left off," Sir Happy replied. "I imagine Farley's visit this morning has led you to believe our work is finished, as though somehow Scotland Yard will miraculously solve the case now that a corpse has been added to the pile of attacks. The proverbial last straw for the fires of justice to ignite upon. If that is the case, you are mistaken. Please do not misunderstand me, Marmee. I dearly like and admire Hiram, and have complete faith in his abilities as an inspector, but I do not believe he is following the proper lead. It is true, our culprit is a canine bred for violence, and based on all of the evidence before us, is of a considerable size and strength. I do not believe, however, we will find the creature fighting in the pits of London. The level of what you call unbridled rage indicated in each of the attacks suggests he no longer has the outlet for that rage in the pits. He is using these attacks as his release, and he has now made his first kill. He will be hungry for more blood. We must track him back to his lair before he has a chance to kill again." Sir Happy jumped into action, gathering together the crime scene photos and preparing for the journey ahead. "Where do we start?" I asked. Sir Happy merely grunted in my direction without looking up from his activity. "Perhaps," I suggested, "we could pay a visit to the newest crime scene. I believe it is just around the corner from us. Although it has been many hours since the murder occurred, we might be able to gather some useful clues from the surrounding area." Sir Happy perked up and smiled as he placed the last photo in its proper place. "That's the spirit, old chap. Now you are thinking like a real detective. Come along, Mommy. We have a murder to solve and a killer to catch. The chase is on." With that, we were off to Lexington Courts. The weather smiled upon us, for there had been no rain for the last few days, a rarity for a city known for its often gloomy weather. No rain meant little chance of any evidence at the crime scene being washed away. There was bound to be a clue or two left for him to find, something which had been overlooked by the authorities. Few things ever got past my friend's supremely keen, almost eerie sense of smell. I was anticipating there being at least one officer on guard to protect the sanctity of the crime, and I wondered, as we traveled, how we would manage to get past his watchful eye to perform our own inspection of the sites. Upon arriving at Lexington Court, I was surprised to see the place abandoned by the police entirely. Not only that, but the authorities, in their hasty departure, had failed to mark off the crime scene in any way. Why on earth would the constables not set up markers to prevent any sort of contamination or tampering with the evidence? I asked, allowing the full measure of my annoyance to reflect in my voice. Do they want the perpetrator to get away? Sir Happy snorted his own disgust, replying, "Apparently, the officials did not see the need to cordon off the area from the public. They assumed there was nothing more to find. Last night, they believed it to be an animal attack, with little to examine, aside from the poor man's body. The investigators of the yard do not collect what they cannot see, so they took the body and left the rest of the area for the public disinfectors. That is, if the constables even bother to summon them to the sites, which I very much hope they do for the sake of public health." "What did you call them?" I asked, never having heard the term before. "The public disinfectors," Sir Happy repeated. "They are a rare but brave breed of public servant that spends most of their time purifying and disinfecting places contaminated by the most infectious of diseases like smallpox, scarlet fever, and influenza. Occasionally, they are called upon by the city or parish officials to provide their services for situations like this. You know, cleaning up areas where dead bodies have been. Whether the bodies are a result of natural death or foul play, the disinfectors prevent the spread of public disease. One cannot be too careful these days, you know." The thought sent a shudder through my whiskers. "I suppose there is a job for everyone," I said. I found the notion a bit bizarre. While Sir Happy turned his attention to the area before us, I watched in eager anticipation as he made the way around the crime scene, inspect and sniffing each section of the ground before going on to the next. It was like watching him walk through the elements of a map or some kind of grid. I know now, after years of studying his techniques, he was indeed creating a map of sorts in his head, cataloging each scent he detected to ensure he would remember not only its location, but the context in which it existed. "We are in luck, Mr. Marmee. The disinfectors have not been here this morning," he called out as he circled near to where the body must have fallen, based on his dark stains soaked into the walkway. "The compounds they use would have eradicated any trace or scent evidence left from the crime committed last night. Providence has definitely smiled upon us today." As he approached the location where the body had been, I saw his hackles go up for a moment, followed by a low but menacing growl. Up to that point, I had never seen such a reaction come from this refined individual. It was a bit of a shock at first, but considering the circumstances, I knew something truly significant had been identified. I gave him a moment to collect himself before yelling out, "What is it, Sir Happy? What have you found?" While his ruff remained noticeably prominent, he composed himself enough to say, "I believe I have found the scent of our killer." This declaration flabbergasted me. Could it really be so easy? I was elated by the news. We finally had something concrete within our paws to work with, something the proper authorities lacked. "It is phenomenal news, my friend," I cried. "It means we have the fiend in our very grasp. Ha ha, you old devil, we've got you by the horns now." I felt so overcome with my feelings of triumph. I began to scamp about like a kitten after a bit of string. My merriment was very quickly interrupted by a sharp, "Stop it, you fool!" I froze at the tone of my companion's voice, knowing I had somehow committed a most grievous sin. I gathered my pride and faced my friend. At first his features were like chiseled marble, cold and unmoving, but ever so slowly I saw those features relax, even softening, as he added, "Please forgive me, Mommy. It came out more harshly than I intended. First of all, dear friend, your frolic was beginning to enter into the areas I have yet to process. Secondly, the situation is not as settled as you might like to imagine. I said I believed I had found the scent of the killer. I did not say it was a certainty. Although my olfactory skills are exceptional, they are not perfect. These are unknown quantities, and I must sort through them. It is like testing apart the tangles in a ball of thread. One cannot do it with a violent yank. It takes time and patience. At the moment, I have nothing to compare the scents I am collecting to, so I am forced to catalogue them until such time as I do. It is only then when a match can be truly identified." "Then what makes you think you smell the scent of our killer?" I asked, a bit annoyed at having been so harshly reprimanded. "In an investigation like this, where little physical evidence is available, you must begin by eliminating the known and to seek to find those elements which are out of place. For example, in the street, there's a strong smell of horse, most likely from the horses used to pull the cabs and carriages through the city. Since this is a major thoroughfare, the presence of horse odors makes sense. I also smell various types of poultry, no doubt from the meat carts on the way to market. I was able to eliminate the sense of the constables who responded to the alarm based on the distinct smell of their rough woolen uniforms, not to mention the odor of cheap shoe black used to shine their shoes. I could even identify the medical examiner. I could remain silent no more. "How in the world can you identify him?" "There was a strong smell of ether near the site of the body, which is indicative of a person in the medical profession. It is used to sedate patients and does not easily remove itself from skin, even when the hands are scrubbed with lye soap." "Oh," was all I could muster to say. I was at a slight disadvantage, having only been exposed to the medical profession within the last few months, but the associations made sense. I encouraged my friend to continue. "Where was I?" Sir Happy continued. "Oh yes, the examiner. I did not smell either directly where the body had been, so I doubt the examiner did more than check for a pulse and confirm on-site McGibbons was dead, before having the body moved to the morgue for a closer examination. I also detected a hint of rotting flesh, which could be attributed to the body carriers, who are the unlucky souls responsible for dealing with the dead, whether it is to bring a corpse to the examiner's office or to the undertaker's hall. The smell of decay was too strong for a corpse so newly dead, so the residue of death had to come from those who deal with death on a daily basis. Naturally, I looked to the body carriers. It left me with 3 unidentified scents. One belonged naturally to the victim, being the strongest where the body lay. The second unidentified smell was intermingled with the victim and was unmistakably canine. I assumed it to belong to our killer, since the molds taken from our murder victim proved it was a canine that killed the man. The last scent I catalogued does not fit and therefore perplexes me greatly. Sir Happy seemed truly out of sorts. With my anger now mollified, I cannot help but respond to my friend's distress. What do you mean, it does not fit? I am not altogether certain what I mean, to be truthful, he replied. I believe the presence of this scent is significant, but I cannot for the life of me figure out what it is doing here. For all I know, this last scent came about after the body was removed, perhaps from a passerby. After all, the authorities made no attempt to cordon off the area to prevent such a contamination, and yet Sir Happy paused in his ramblings to go back over an area he had already scanned with a bit more care than he had taken before. He finally stopped with the telltale aha look he often gets, and said with some certainty, "It smells like a gentleman has been here." Certainly a gentleman has been here, I thought to myself. I am quite certain dozens of gentlemen have been here. It was, after all, a very public causeway with a considerable amount of traffic on the average day. Why wouldn't there be at least one gentleman who marked this course? I could stand my internal arguments no more, and finally asked aloud, why on earth would such a distinction matter in a public place like this? It is elementary, my dear Mommy, he said with a bit of a twinkle in his eyes, because it does. I wish I could offer a deeper and more illuminating explanation for this very ambiguous statement, but as I did not receive one myself at the time, I believe it is best to save the statement's significance and meaning until the moment in which it was revealed to both Sir Happy and me. Understand, I did attempt to press my friend for more information and greater clarification on the matter. All he could offer was an explanation that scenting was very much like dreaming. Sometimes the image was clear and concise, while other times it remained elusive and vague, making narrative or even clarification an impossibility. And so it was with this ambiguous impression under our belts that we paid our first visit to the home of Sir Jeffreys Grayson, father of Penelope Grayson, the latest victim of the K9 killer.